Well, my question, like I've been working with family farms in Cuba, and my question was how to understand the family economy from a diverse economy point of view, taking into account that in the family there are already a lot of norms that is already established. So how to see it from a diverse economy point of view. That's my main issue now, and I'm writing it.
The way I thought maybe that we could
Correct.
interact is like you were describing a situation in which the discourse seems to be very pro-market at the moment. There's some kind of transition being affected among the smallholders you're interviewing. And you're in a context perhaps where there's not as much market pressure yet on these families. I'm not sure. And I'm somewhere in between. That's my schematic.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, like in Cuba, because most of the land is part of the state, they all have a contract with the state to give the products. So it's not a big market, but it's the state-owned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just a bit louder, so people behind you.
Yeah, maybe
And you've got to see for it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So yeah, in that sense, it's also a very specific context.
Okay.
Well, as all the other contexts, but that is not that much connected with a bigger market. It's,
Okay.
Everything stays there. Well, except tobacco that is for exportation.
Tobacco for export. Okay.
Yeah.
And
my research is about legitimization of a market-driven certification system, and the focus is how the process is going on in the local level, the national and subnational level, especially when it comes to the smallholders, because palm oil is very particular for Indonesia. About 65% are exported, and we are #1 producers. And palm oil is a agricultural produce that you cannot eat it directly. You have to process it into something, right? And so when a farmer, for example, they cultivate palm oil, they will not. They don't plant it for eating. They have to sell it for something else. And so currently, my preliminary conclusion is that the process of this market-driven certification system, it introduces values of sustainability like environmentally friendly, socially justice, production. But when it comes to smallholders, they internalize the value, that is the positive point, but at the same time it creates dependency because they formerly, for example, they were fishermen or they do anything else, but then they see but that they can do palm oil farming, palm cultivation in sustainable way. So this legitimizing the market logics, farming system, So, and it makes them they feel right that they are in the they are cultivating palm oil, but in the sustainable way. So they are become dependent to the system, the value chain of palm oil.
And it's a launching pad for, at least for me, to think about also what's happening in Bhutan, which is increasingly dependent on trade with India. They just signed a free trade agreement with Bangladesh, and despite having a constitutional article talking about gross national happiness since 2008, the new government that was formed in 2012 is increasingly talking about growth, GDP. So there is a tension within Bhutan, and I think there's a very interesting experiment going on right now to fight what is becoming increasingly dependency in the country on rice and meat, and that has everything to do with the food that we're producing within a community. And Samdra Jokhar is one region, 1 out of 20 zonkas, 1 of 20 little districts in Bhutan, which is using a kind of different model of GNH than the national model. And they have this Lama, it's a Nyingma community leader, he's a Buddhist Lama, Rinpoche, who has started this civil society initiative called Tendujapar Initiative, and he's saying, I don't think the GNH that's being practiced at the national level is working, and I think we can do it locally. So this is really like, it's led by a religious leader, but there is a lot of community support, and that's an organization I'm trying to work with to understand how you can reinterpret even food sovereignty and gross national happiness for a kind of resistant model. It's difficult because there's a lot of tension within the terms. I don't want to assume that this is like the correct way to do it. But basically they're talking about redirecting value systems within the family, redirecting educational systems, talking about food production in the community, food self-sufficiency. And that means realigning your values from a system that prioritizes like high
Production.
Yeah. Basically, in higher education, like it's not going to industrialize in Bhutan. They're not planning to. They plan to go 100% organic by 2020, but that's really for international trade. It's not for national consumption.
Yeah.
They're not selling their organic produce.
They're importing all the shit.
Yeah.
So can I ask what happens when we add a gender dimension to this discussion? Like, because I'm interested to hear where in the family situations, in the households or the smallholder, which is usually a family production unit of some kind, what's the position of women in these kinds of situations? Is it, I mean,
Yeah, like for me that I interviewed all the members of the household, and for me it was interesting to see how their needs or their encounters or the relation were because of their gender. Like most of the women are in the kitchen or taking care of the kids, like really role specific, and then their needs. Some of them were also connected to the land in the sense of working the land because they were also working there, but they were mostly worried about the food and the clothes, and then the men were more worried about if they could maybe have a tractor someday, or like really specific for them.
and so in terms of production units, there was a strict division of labour. Were the women also marketing stuff? I'm not allowed.
I had 6 farms, and there was a lot of diversity also.
Right.
Like, because each family is another world, then each farm was also completely another story.
Yeah.
So the organization was also different,
Yeah.
but the roles were quite the same for all the farms.
Right.
in that sense.
So none of them worked in a more cooperative kind of way with older children, for instance,
Yeah,
sharing things.
Yes, there was one that was really like everybody was doing everything, even though like some people had specific duties every day, like just to make life easier. But if one day one person was not there, they could just switch and do it the other way around. But the majority of the farms were really like structured
in a more patriarchal kind of
Yes.
system.
Yeah.
And what about in Bhutan? What's the one of all the places you were working anyway?
It was, I think, a central preoccupation of the reading group that we started with gender studies.
Yeah.
Because we are seeing a huge shift in things like body image, for example, and with that, the desires, obviously, of what women want to do with their lives.
Yeah.
So on one hand, Bhutan, in the 2 majority communities, inherits land through women. It's matrilineal. Despite that, when you look at the gross national happiness statistics, which have a lot of immaterial indicators like psychological well-being, negative affect, spirituality, women do much worse than men.
Are there any gender-specific indicators or indicators of gender equality?
No.
See, this is interesting.
Yeah. But there's a report, there's like a sub-report authored by who's the author of the author of the J&H Index the report. He co-authored a paper with this anthropologist working in Bhutan talking about the gender disparity in J&H, so they're aware of it. But there's I mean, at the policy level, there's going to be a obviously like something lost in translation. They're not talking about that so much in the parliament.
Yeah, it's interesting because another country that's trying to do this is Vanuatu in the Pacific, where they've got a real interest in the custom economy, custom being a kind of language for the traditional subsistence economy, and they've introduced these indicators of a gross national happiness kind of indicator as well, and no gender indicators. And so I was involved in a project in the Pacific, which is where the floating coconut came from, which was about saying how do we generate community-based indicators of gender equality or gender equity, and what does gender equity even mean in different contexts, because it's a very Western feminist kind of idea. So we started talking about how do men and women see their roles and togetherness and sharing and all this kind of stuff to try and generate stuff from below. But when then Vanuatu is a country like Bhutan that's trying to institute this at a state level, and gender wasn't there at all. So anyway, that's another conversation to have. But I'm just thinking then in terms of the smallholders doing oil palm, what are the gender relations going on in those production units, and whether there's any openings for an interesting kind of discussion.
So this part, the division of labor, it really depends on whether the work requires muscles or not. So,
right.
Yeah. Because doing palm oil cultivation is really hard.
Yeah.
And it's quite dangerous and harvesting, for example, because palm oil are precise.
Yeah.
And usually, but women are they are engaged in, for example, administrative works.
In the plants?
Cooperatives, for example, and also they do the pesticides spraying. Yeah, so things that.
And how do they get paid?
In palm oil sectors, there is this quite complex because first we have to divide in smallholders. There is keen smallholders and independent smallholders.
Right.
And let's focus in independent smallholders. There are those that are just individual smallholders or households, and those that are in cooperatives.
Mm-hmm.
And in the cooperatives, you do it collectively.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they manage everything in cooperative, and for example, who do the works for the harvesting, and all the incomes also managed by the cooperatives, and cooperatives also is used as pool for the harvest.
Do they pay everybody equally, or
yeah,
everyone gets an equal share?
It depends on for example, it depends on the size of the plantation they have, and also then there is extra. For example, if you do the spraying and you do the administrative work, there is extra payment for that.
Well, interesting, because I did some work on oil palm smallholders in Papua New Guinea, and what drew me to it was one of the companies. These were all smallholders. Some of them, were migrants had come into a different area from one part to the other. Others were village producers. But what was happening was the production was very low because people still had access to other gardens and other jobs, and so they'd only harvest the oil palm when they needed cash. So there was a lot of stuff being left on the trees. Anyway, there was an attempt to try and up production, but one thing they did was women would only, because it's a very, it's a very taxing kind of job. When the oil palm dropped down to the ground, it was always very, the ripest drop, whatever they are, seeds or whatever, fall off. And so women would pick them up and collect them into a separate pile because the company decided to, was a very interesting kind of guy. Ooh, that's my phone. He sounds like a cricket. I'll just turn it off. No, just let it go. They introduced this thing called the mama card. So they would pay women separately for collecting the ripe oil palm droplets, as opposed to the big things with the men. Because the women would normally, well, in some cases the women and men were working together, but the women never got any payment. The men would get the payment, and they would then distribute it within the family, and often the woman didn't get it because they'd go off and do something with it. So once the company introduced this separate card, suddenly production rose because the women had an incentive, this is kind of classic kind of incentive kind of stuff, to collect it, and then all of a sudden they would have their own funds and they were getting cooking pots and mattresses and all the things that they wanted. So it was an interesting kind of reflection on the household dynamics which were standing in the way of certain kinds of efficient production. But the other thing that was happening there was the next generation, the kids, the young boys in particular, weren't helping their fathers because they wouldn't get any funding. The father wouldn't give any money to them. So
They were helping the mother.
So they just would go off and be rascals, But so there was, once this mama card worked, there was an interest in starting to introduce another card for young men who might work as labour teams to go around helping harvest, so that they would get their own funds and have an incentive to work. But so what it was interesting, it was looking at both the options people had for other subsistence, because there were other things, they didn't need to be totally tied into that oil palm. But then the company was studying how households worked and using that to kind of distribute the funds, which isn't necessarily a non-progressive thing to do, except that oil palm is a hideous thing, and I mean, once you think about that, it's a terrible thing. But anyway, I mean, there's ways in which I think the family dynamics, some families worked as cooperatives within their family, that sharing the funds between the older kids and the woman, and others worked in a very patriarchal way. And so it was interesting to see the variation within families where you can actually apply a kind of a class analysis if you're interested in doing so, in terms of how the subsistence is being kind of meted out and how the surplus is being divided. And some people have done that for households. So I think there's interesting stuff to do in differentiating households, not just seeing them all as one thing or another. Jessica wanted to jump in from the outside
I just had a question.
into the fishbowl.
Maybe it's taking us off track, but when we look at this example that you just gave, did that restructure or impact how households operated? Because
Yeah,
women were-
it did, because women, it's a classic case of women got some economics income and then had more of a say within the family, and it was a form of economic empowerment to
It
some
didn't create
extent.
any backlash with men worried about this new economic empowerment?
Yeah, I think it probably did, but I don't have any data on that side of it all. I mean, it's, I think that kind of, what was interesting was the way in which, I guess, the guy who was introducing this within the firm was quite a progressive person. He could see that domestic violence was a big issue because men wouldn't share the income they had, or they'd drink it or gamble it. So in a way it was producing more social cohesion within families because of the distribution of income. Unfortunately it was doing so within this framework of a hideously degrading economic, environmental business kind of thing. So, but
Curious tension.
yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. But I mean, sometimes going in on the gender angle gives you an opening to think about what possibilities there might be even within these frameworks there, where there's a lot of other things going on that are quite detrimental. But but you can't deny the fact that women's empowerment has also gone along with capitalist development. Now, whether you want to say there's a one-to-one relationship between that, I don't think I want to, but it can be a vehicle, especially if there's equitable forms of distributing funds for some kind of women's empowerment. But how we think about strengthening other forms of agriculture against that kind of export model, that's another whole set of questions. Yeah.
I'm kind of interested in human development, like questions of what is well-being, the basic questions that I need. And I feel that there's a very interesting, at least so far in my reading, I'm finding one theorist, Patricia Greenfield, very relevant for me. It's kind of in cultural psychology. She posits that there's universal, perhaps, development, that we're raising human beings. And that generally that we can see maybe two cultural pathways. So rather than thinking of collective and independent types, or Asian and Western, we can maybe break down the national boundaries and talk about interdependence orientation and independence orientation. And you can see that perhaps within even Oklahoma, which is where my family lives. So it's not useful to talk about maybe capitalist and non-capitalist or traditional and modern. In this case, the kind of independence pathway ends up with people who live in nuclear families, who have been taught theoretical knowledge in a formal school, and were raised in families by mothers who either gave the labor of childcare to other people, or to machine with bottles, etc. technology. So that's one pathway, because she split it into three stages of development. Interdependence, orientation, you end up with people who are embedded in joint families, for example, who were raised in outside of formal schooling and usually in skilled environments where Barbara Rogoff talks about kind of situated reason, so where Stephen Goodman talks about kind of scaling, right? Typically leading and food production. And then before that, you can, at the very early stage, 0 to 3 years old, children are on the back. They sleep with their parents. They're breastfed for much longer. So that I find that if I want to talk about a shift to interdependence, to non-human also interdependence, I would like to see more attention paid to the kind of childcare practices that are going on. It's one way of understanding how we're producing human beings for one model of economy. And on the other hand, we can actually be doing other practices in the first 10 years of life that set up people for a different subjectivity. And I think that my problem is right now, what do you do when you find people coming out of an interdependence model who want to be?
Right.
They want to be in a university, and that's what I am hearing also happening in Bhutan. A lot of these young women have left the countryside. It has one of the highest urbanization change rates in South Asia, and the Dongkad I'm interested in, Samdujokar, 60% of people have left their villages that are empty. So these young women don't want to stay there.
No, but in a society, in a world in which agricultural production is demoted, in which just exploiting the environment is seen as the norm, and that the bright lights argument is, it's very hard to have a culture that supports the idea that there might be a valuable lifestyle for a woman in a rural community, I think, in most of the so-called, in the majority world. And that's a huge challenge. But just on the child rearing thing, you could be interested in the work of Kelly Dombrovsky, who's did a PhD with me, and she worked in China, in Xining, and also with a network of women in Australia and New Zealand, and she was interested in the whole practice of holding children out, or what the West called elimination communication, which is all the communication around shitting and peeing that is dealt with without nappies, without diapers in so much of the world, and is all around communication between a child and mother or grandmother, which is much, and it goes against the whole Western vision of toilet training and so on. So, and it fits, so she was interested in China and to why it is that milk formula has been so quickly adopted, but disposable nappies or nappies haven't been, and the average family would still only use one nappy per child, partly because they're still using this other mechanism of elimination communication, or banyao. So her argument, her kind of analysis, and then of course women in the West are now very interested in this because of its environmental impact. Disposable nappies are one of the biggest forms of landfill in the world, etc. but it's also a form of attachment parenting, which is getting a lot more interest and so on, and is about different forms of communication with beings that, you know, in Freudian sort of psychology don't have that self-knowledge until a certain point, whereas the whole rest of the world shows that actually kids can control their sphincter and all these other things much earlier, before age 4 and so on. So I think there's a lot going on around this notion of care and of interconnection that is, you know, is fascinating for thinking about alternative pathways for society as well. I'm wary of those kind of this is interdependent, this is individual, and that kind of rolling it all in together into those things. It's problematic, but I think, and then again, in her case, she shows how the adoption of milk formula fits so well with Chinese medicine visions of the postpartum body. Like in Chinese medicine, as soon as you give birth, you actually are supposed to eat certain things, and you give food to the child. I mean, it's a very different kind of conception. And so child formula as a way of boosting the child's health and the woman's, and leaving the woman to rest, fits within a kind of conception that comes out of a different whole medical model, even though breastfeeding is still seen as good. And you know, of course, women go to work straight away, and their grandmothers look after children and all these other things. But it's all very kind of up for grabs as to how this works. Whereas, anyway, there's a whole fascinating area here of anti-essentialist thinking, really, in all these realms that can lead then to other models of well-being and society.
To clarify, it's a spectrum. It's not imagined to be really.
One or the
they're
other.
not in existence in pure form. And I'm also very critical.
Poor thing.
Yeah.
You can drop out of the fishbowl if you like.
I need water.
But I'm thinking we should probably round this discussion up, because we've probably taken a bit longer than one, and we could move on to another group. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Now, who is it that hasn't done anything yet?
One is just leaving, but Veerle, you had a group with Inez and maybe Esther?
Yes, why not?
Yeah.
Inez just left the group.
Yeah.
I'll take over the camera. Do I need to do anything, or can we just
I think we can just leave it. I zoom in a bit.
New group. We can try and squeeze 2 more groups in. So who is the people that still haven't done one?
I think Jessica and
We haven't done one, but
Arno.
we've talked quite a bit. Maybe some of the younger researchers who want to share.
Okay, anyway, let's get going on this one. And who else is joining you?
Yes,
but
Inez
I
just went out to the toilet.
Okay.
But maybe we can start.
Well, let's start anyway.
Yeah, because I wanted to reply to what her question was.
Oh, what was her question?
I think she said how to activate people.
Oh, that's right.
Didn't she?
Yeah, it remains a difficulty how to actually activate people and how to engage with a wider audience. Yeah, let's start on that.
Should I just start? Well, because actually I've been doing research on community gardens, and I'm writing a paper with Mariana. And we were thinking that, or I'm thinking, that actually enjoying stuff is really important, enjoying something. And therefore I think sometimes activate sounds so like activism, but I think often people don't do things necessarily for ethical or political reasons, but because they enjoy them, and the outcome may be something that. Hi, I'm replying to your question.
Don't leave the room. That's the. If you leave the room, you get put in.
Yeah. You get punished. Unless you're done, of course. But no, I was just saying, because your question is how to activate people, and I thought that it's very important that people do things that they like, or that, well, we call it affinity, or communities of affinity will actually engage people. So maybe it's not so much about the ethical and political thoughts that, you know, the assumption that people will do things because they think they're good for the world, but I kind of feel that people do things because they enjoy them, and then sort of the side outcome, or, you know, another outcome that it could be good for the world. So I looked at community gardening, which may have various benefits, but I felt that the people engaged in community gardening often, they are aware of these benefits, but those are not the reasons for joining. So they do it just because they like it, because they like to work with the neighbors, or because they just like to be with their hands in the soil, or in a way also because they like to do something for the neighborhood and to create a beautiful neighborhood, but not so much from an ethical or political thought, but just, affinity.
Yeah, well, like I just said, I wrote it because I'm part of this otherwise critical student group, and we like to reach a more broader audience, because indeed we have include now people who like to do the things we are interested in, but we are very much struggling how to reach other people who are non-typical otherwise people. And because, well, we have strong ideas and actually maybe two ideals, and but yeah, how to.
But what is your idea about reaching them? Like, you want them to start to do stuff, or to know stuff, or come to activities, or?
Yeah, to. Because we think it's also good for us as an organization to include more different opinions and meanings and ideas, and to get these debates. And because we kind of strongly think also in this approach of transformative learning, and by involving people and having the debate.
Yeah.
We want to.
I'm just thinking maybe, well, I don't know exactly what the message is, of course, but maybe it could work to broaden the message, or to broaden that your communication, because if you use one type of communication and you get everybody the same people, then if you don't change that.
Maybe there's other strategies that people have already used around the room for activating. I mean, are there, if that's the term, or increasing pleasure. Has anyone got some practice that they've used in their research for involving people? I mean, again, the question of what the objective is an issue. I think. Yeah.
I think people get easily, well, it kind of relates to what Esther was saying. People get easily activated when it comes to something they like. Like if you ask, for instance, if you ask people about their hobbies or about their passions, they would talk to you for hours. I mean, that's the experience I got with my research. So maybe it's also a way of finding common grounds where you can, like something you share with that broader audience, where you can sort of meet and engage them in that first contact at least, and then from there on it might be easier to take them wherever you want to take them.
Well, it sounded a bit like.
Maybe you should come in on what was your concern.
Well, not particularly related to this point, but I do sort of wonder if you then activate. I do think it's important okay, so when I listen to you, I sort of feel like, yeah, of course, and I'd like to be activated, and I'd like to be activated in a way that I also enjoy. But of course, I have the free time to enjoy myself. There's a lot of, perhaps, normative statement, more problematic aspects of capitalism, or capitalist practice, or whatever you want to call it. That unpaid labor, for instance, there's little fun then in saying, well, just come to my community garden. That's, there's a bit of it has a lot of relevance, but not everywhere. And it doesn't have to be, maybe, but that's then my first, if that's what it works in, of course we can have fun here.
I mean, it reminds me of the kind of debate that someone, or the writing that Latour's had around questions of matters of fact versus matters of concern, and he's interested in politics that is not about, showing the oppression of the world and therefore mobilising people, which perhaps might be more where some student organisations are focused, and let's look at what's terrible and that'll mobilise. So the old kind of classic kind of organisational structure, versus the kind of idea that there might be these kind of matters of concern to people that assembles a much wider collective that might not be seen as a collective at all, but a group that starts to be passionate about something. Maybe it's something they don't like. I mean, the work that he's done, or other people within that kind of actor network framework have done, as things around health, for instance, muscular dystrophy and so on, that there are these concerns people have for perhaps family members that they're caring for, that is increasing their work in the day, that become points of connection for a different kind of activity, which lines then with different kinds of research and different kinds of strategies and so on. But it's a very different kind of model of politics, that it does start with where you're really somehow concerned or committed or passionate or worried or impinged upon in some way, that moves out from there to the wider questions, which aren't necessarily structured around a kind of systemic oppression or something like that. So it's a matter of kind of finding those matters of concern, and building through research, building the kind of assemblages that might help those matters of concern to be voiced more. And I think at the moment, in the world, we've got a lot of questions that can't easily be smushed into the structural understanding or argument. And so that kind of form of politics, which is it's a different kind of politics than the old mobilising and marching kind of thing, although some of that might feed into it. It's a different kind of way of thinking about what is the agent, what is the agent of change. And it can be a much more diffused assemblage. So, to some extent, are community gardens part of a worldwide assemblage of change around food production? I think one could start to make those connections. It's not that the people who are enjoying getting their hands in the soil want to be part of a sign-up card-carrying member of a global formation, but there is a way in which we could start to see them as part of an assemblage that is having some impact on cities, on global politics and so on.
Yeah, but I agree with you, but I feel sometimes it is sort of an accidental assemblage. So,
contingency is part of it, I think. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that has to be seen as how agency begins often. I mean, we're all contingent beings in terms of which country we were born into, what class, what race, whatever. So in a way, how we then become subjects is always contingent. So why couldn't politics also come out of contingencies like this?
I burning question, because I wonder, so let's say we go with this strategy of creating enjoyment around sustainable practices and sort of getting people on board like that, and I'm simplifying.
Yeah.
But then, isn't it also very relevant to pay attention to what kind of problem analysis?
Well, I'd say passion rather than enjoyment, because I think people can be passionate about very bad things. Passionate to do something about whatever it is, environmental racism or whatever. So I think I would say rather than enjoyment, I mean, and if you're a psychoanalyst, enjoyment can come from bad things too, It's a passionate commitment or a connection to something, I think, more than enjoyment. I think enjoyment has that, it's all comfortable kind of vision.
But then there's this book of Tanya Lee, the anthropologist, The Will to Improve, where she sort of analyzes policies, and the policymakers, she later confronts them because she discovered quite a dominant neoliberal ideology in their policies. And then these policymakers, they react sort of shocked. This is like, of course I oppose neoliberalism. I don't want to reproduce that. And then still they do it. So sometimes I wonder, isn't it super relevant to know what you're against? And so rather than saying I'm because everybody's politically correct and everybody says I oppose neoliberalism, but sometimes I have a feeling that I don't even know how to define it myself.
No.
I don't know whether there is a clear definition available, but maybe it would have political relevance, not with everybody, but because I understand that not everybody cares, of course, and maybe others could get on board through creating a fashion, making it enjoyable, whatever. But still, isn't it very relevant for at least for people like who are in this room today, to sort of start discussing, okay, but what then is it that we're against? What is it then within capitalist discourse that creates these inequalities or reproduces these inequalities? Because then there are also positive outcomes of capitalist practices sometimes. Maybe we could.
Okay. Let's stop there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to get everything in there.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think you can break things down in terms of a kind of form of individualism that is harnessed into many political philosophies, and neoliberalism is one of them that has harnessed that and has used it quite effectively. So rather than having to, talk about these big systems again, we can start to break down things into the practices that we're talking about that are perhaps dangerous or not dangerous or can be taken both ways. And that's really where I would start to bring it back. There are unintended consequences of a lot of policies as well, and I think you had James Ferguson here recently talking about questions of basic income grants being offered, say in South Africa or in Namibia, which to some people would be read as a form of neoliberalism because it's kind of an individuation of a payment, and other people would see it as an opportunity for collective sharing of the Commonwealth that everybody should have a claim on and can be started to be used in different ways. So again, I mean, I think these things, you have to start unpacking the big terms and come down to what you're really concerned about and identifying what those things are. And we've already had a discussion where some forms of individualism are going to allow women, like individual payments, are going to allow them to have empowerment within a family. Other forms of individualism are going to lead towards the breakdown and de-skilling of food production, etc. There's no answer here. This is an anti-essentialist world. We have to do the work of making the connections, and that's what the theorist is to do. You can't just take these concepts down from the shelf and just say that's what it is. You as researchers have to be doing the connecting and making the connecting, and then what connections you want to make is up to you. But I think we should get another group because we've got another 20 minutes, and I think we've got some other interesting topics as well. So, okay?
Yeah.
All right. Now, come on. Who else? Alberto, Lian, Anom. Who wants to go next?
We are.
Yeah? Josh, come on. Let's have some. Lian, you want to come on? Oh, you're going to do it. Well, maybe we might have to break up the dualisms. Yeah. We could just get going anyway. Who else? We need. Oh, I've got 3. Okay. Good go. Right, who's going to start?
Ladies first.
Yeah.
Josh, come on. Tell us what you're doing, what your questions are.
Actually, we have already shared some interests already, but we didn't have enough time to share ideas and questions concerning our research. So, would you share your ideas?
Well, you should share what you've shared with Inez.
Okay, let me start first. Yeah, my topic is about emergent actors in the era of post-productivist society. But before talking about such an emergent actor or new actor in transforming society, I'd like to talk about, at the same time, I'd like to question by myself, and also I want to share with you to what extent we can understand, we can contextualize diverse economies. I mean, diverse economies in the such kind of extension of capitalism system, or somehow out of the capitalism system. At the same time, how we should understand the capitalism system, because different Marxists have translated different dimensions of the capitalism system. At the same time, capitalism as an object cannot be existed by itself. It means that capitalism as object should be connected with other kind of object, which could reflect capitalism or feudalism or other kind of ideology or system. So how we should contextualize the capitalism itself first. Then we can talk about how, to what extent we can consider diverse economies. Because these days, as Katherine mentioned, everything has been changing, right? And everyone tries to contextualize their initiatives with the context of diverse economies. I agree, because they should have for sure different dimensions of development. But still, I'm wondering by myself, because we have already witnessed kind of capital centralism. It means that capitalism has very strong power in the course of time, kind of like gravity, like very strong time dimensions, by which many kind of things have somehow converged in the power of capitalism still. So how to understand diverse economies in such strong power of capitalism? That is one of my questions.
All right, guys, answer him. Get going.
Well, the way I see it, you could say that capitalism is part of diverse economies, right? It's like one of the ways economic relations can be organized. So I would kind of turn it around, maybe what you're saying, and well, say it's broader than that. But then my question was between the economic and the social and the cultural, and I think that relates to the fact that, for instance, within my topic, when which is about subsistence gardening, and then when I tell people that I'm looking at the economic aspects of it, they would understand the economic as the financial, and they would say like, so you're trying to put a monetary value on it. And that was my concern about the cooptation, because indeed, mostly when people talk about the economy, they're referring to the capitalist economy, and that's kind of the default understanding. So then, while we are trying to expand that notion of the economy, what can happen is that it kind of goes the other way around, and instead we start interpreting things that are broader than that within this narrow logic.
So let's hear your questions, Alberto, and then we can.
And then we're going to answer that.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah, so we had a very nice discussion before during break, and like my current interest is in studying food initiatives that are clearly opposed to capitalism and neoliberalism, but the struggle with how can we make sure that some initiatives are really detached from such ideology. And we were speaking how this can be researched.
What are the practices that you're looking at? I'm going to have to come in here, I think.
Like sometimes like farmers markets, community support agriculture related to be opposed to neoliberalism and capitalism. But that's not always the case. So I would be interested to study those initiatives and to understand if they are opposed to ideology. And I would like to know how it's really to study. So I think it's similar to this concern. And
what are you including in the term capitalism?
I think like the aspect that you elaborate on, that which is like all the practices.
But there seem to be a lot more than that.
I mean,
what you're talking
many
about.
things, many objects are having reducible to monetary relationship rather than social or cultural.
So monetary relationships. What else?
And others. Because I'm
I mean,
divided
the way you were talking, it sounded pretty big.
Yeah.
Like everything.
Monetary relationship. Others.
So if you go to practices, it's hard to do that. But anyway, do you want to make it come up?
I find this question to be really essential to whatever we're trying to do. And I think that's why I was really struggling with trying to figure out my own question about this. I mean, if we're disaggregating what we are calling capitalism, even in non-capitalist practices or alternative capitalist practices, that might show the effects of capital accumulation and processes of capital accumulation that might be termed deleterious or somehow bad in the context we're thinking about. I mean, it's I mean, this to me is like the most difficult thing in trying to unpack.
Well, I mean, for me, it comes to the question of ist and ism. You know, like if once we use the term a capitalist something as an adjective, and then well, that's not so bad if it goes with capitalist practice, which to me, I take a very narrow. I mean, this is my anti-essentialism. I take it back purely to a form of capitalist business model, which is a private accumulation of surplus that's been extracted from labour.
Okay.
That's a very minimalist understanding of a capitalist class practice. Now, how that gets associated with markets, with commodification, with private property, with banking systems, with all these other things, is very contingent and specific and historical. And for me, I don't enroll them into the ism, which says the world became capitalist and then capitalism was everywhere and banks shored up this and culture shored up this and everything got lined up. And that's my queer theorizing, because the lining up of all these things into as something that all reproduces itself is a strong theory. And to pull it apart and to say these things are existing, you know, that the Rockefellers became bankers through developing these, you know, railway lines, and then they used that capital to do what, and set up the Bellagio Conference Centre for me to go and write my book, and etc. You know, like multiple contradictory things happening that we could choose to fold into one big thing, which then is very hard to get rid of because it keeps rolling down on top of us, or we could make it into these other things in which they are all happening within something called a diverse economy. But having said that, I think there is a problem with economizing everything or seeing everything as an economy. Although if you have a kind of overdetermined world, everything is economic, everything is social, everything is environmental, it's just depending on what entry point you take into it that you're going to start unpacking things and making categories to help you say something. So the danger with economies subsuming then all social practices, you know, is the kind of danger we've had with someone like, you know, talking about human capital. I mean, the capital, in a sense, it already has done that in the development world. Everything's either physical capital, natural capital, human capital, social capital, blah, blah. Everything has already become something capital. Not diverse. But at the same time, that's an entry point that is allowing you to do certain things. And to challenge that entry point, that economic entry point with diverse economies is one way to kind of destabilize it. I don't think it's necessarily, it's still keeping economy as somehow a master term, which I think is problematic, which is kind of what I'm going to try and talk about in my lecture tomorrow. But
do you see social as a problematic master term?
Well, I mean, I guess in sociology it might be, you know. What is the social? I mean, I guess that's, again, what do we unpack it to? What are the processes that are social? I guess all I can do is think about things in terms of practices and go back to that and then decide, you know, for what, I mean, it really depends on what purpose you have. I don't have an abstract understanding of these things in a sense. It's like, what is the problematic of the context that I'm working in, and what concepts do I need to help me say something or say something different? So that's starting with the grass at a different level. I mean, in the old days I wrote a book called, an article, and it was informed of something else, called Levels of Abstraction, you know, and that there are these kind of very high levels and then you move down towards the more empirical and the low level. and it's worth kind of thinking about where research projects are pitched, at what level of abstraction. And when you're working at that very high level of abstraction, something like capitalism might have relevance to you. If you're working at a lower level, I'd rather unpack things into practices, and to me, the politics is much more on that bottom level than it is at the top level, because we've worked at the top level for so long, we haven't changed the world that much. It's got much worse. So I'm looking for other models of doing politics, which is why that kind of other system works. But it's you know, one can see everything. You know, you can see the world as living within a capital C, and good luck to you if you think that's going to change the world.
And also, even the problem of it isn't, but at the same time, as you somehow mentioned the language.
Yeah.
I mean, as Tulej and Katherine has mentioned, as Cook many times mentioned the language. Language itself has power.
Yes, it does.
Power,
And
which is very dangerous. Capitalism itself is dangerous.
Yeah.
At the same time, many kinds of economic terms are dangerous, and also social terms are dangerous itself.
That's right.
Yes.
But there's a lot more than, I mean, I think this is where the material semiotics stuff is so interesting, that you know, the language becomes embedded in material practices, in institutions, in technologies, and that's what's stopping so many of the changes we'd like to see.
Yeah.
So it's a much more infrastructural kind of system. It's not the dynamics of accumulation so much, it is the kinds of bank networks, the kinds of property law that has become enmeshed, that is standing in the way of the kinds of changes. So I'm interested in not just the discourse, the representations, but the actual material practices and durable institutions and so on that have been created within a particular moment, that then shore up certain kinds of relationships, and how we start to develop other institutions, other practices, other metrics, and so on. And I think that's where I think moving out of the post-structuralist kind of discursive realm into the material has been very important for politics, but it opens up a whole lot more questions around, you know, say for instance community gardens that are operating in, you know, intermittent spaces or spaces that are not being used at any time. How is it that they can actually institute some kind of property practice or property law that will support them into the future, versus be able to be there for a while and then wiped out because of some political process which says, no, we want to build a car park on it, which is kind of what's happened in some of the processes I've been involved in Paris. So, you know, and there's a lot of lawyers now interested in the new kinds of law that might emerge. I mean, there's the community interest corporation, it's a new kind of corporate law, new kinds of property law that might support a more collective subjectivity and so on, and that's as important as anything else. So, but I don't want to see that as an ism necessarily. I want to see it as different kinds of practices. That some of them are legal practices, some of them are psychological practices. It's like getting down to that lower level. Who is it that missed out? We've got 5 minutes. Siska. Leon. Anna. I think we're going to have discussions over lunch. I can't see anything else but that. So, thank you. Well, I found it really interesting to find out a little bit more about what you're doing, and given that you're the next generation of scholars, looking forward to reading all your books in the next 10 years and seeing what you came up with. You want to do, I think we can probably, unless someone wants to make a last statement.
Last statement or remark.
Perhaps we all wrap it up and have lunch. Okay, well, thank you.
So, to officially thank you, I would like to give you a applause.
Oh no. Sorry. Oh no. I travel with cabin luggage only. I hope it's an edible one.
Maybe you give it away.
Okay. I shouldn't respond like that to every time someone gives me a gift. Oh no.
It's a very cute bag.
Thank
It's the only bag I got for my niece actually. But But I got two little things, and one is a cheese that's being produced in the area of Amsterdam.
Oh, we got to eat it now then. Because you can't take cheese back to Australia.
Well, I did put it. It's in a vacuum. Do they allow you to bring it in?
Nah.
Okay, we share it.
We
over.
got
It's the Dekker cheese.
Oh, fantastic.
I think it's one of the best.
All right. Well, I think there's enough for everyone. Great. Thank you.
Completely in the idea of the community economies, I have something that is homemade.
Oh, great.
Elderflower lemonade.
Oh.
Diluted with some water. With
great.
real Amsterdam elderflowers and homemade ones.
Oh, wow. We can have that for lunch. That's great. Because everyone can have some elderflower. What is it? Like a cordial.
Yeah, cordial.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, look at that. It's not what it looks like, but it's and it's very yellow. It's a very Dutch colour. It should be orange. Great. Well, thank you very much.